In this video, we're going to talk about commas. Yep, a whole chapter just on commas. Commas, commas, commas. Nothing confuses writers, editors, students, and everyone else more than commas. Some of us don't like commas and use too few of them. Other of us don't really know where they belong and use too many of them. There are many comma rules. There are also some places where a comma is optional. The main use of a comma is to make writing easier and clearer to read. But there are many situations where a comma rule really doesn't make anything clearer, but is expected of good writers. So what to do? In this chapter, I will give you the comma rules, but more than lengthy explanations, I will give you examples. Sometimes an example is worth 1,000 words. There are two basic comma rules. Don't use a comma unless you have a reason to do so. Use a comma anywhere where not using one would cause the reader confusion. Here are the rules. One of the most common uses of the comma is in a series. This can be a series of words, phrases, or sentences. I bought oranges, apples, bananas, pears, and grapes. So here you have a series of words in which you need to put a comma in between each word, or between prepositional phrases. I went to the museum, to the mall, to the post office. So here you have a series of phrases in which you can use a comma. Mary went to see a movie. Mary went to visit Grandma. Dad went to an auto race. And I stayed home. So here you can use commas for a series of sentences. So what about that final comma, the one before and? Do you need that one? That one is famously called the Oxford comma because it was first used by the Oxford University Press. Some people use it and others don't. Unless you are following a particular style guide that dictates whether or not to use it, it is really up to you. The only advice I have is this. Whether or not you decide to use the Oxford comma, use it or don't use it consistently within one piece of writing. Don't switch around. Warning. Sometimes leaving out the Oxford comma can cause confusion. Sometimes putting it in can also cause confusion. So watch out for these instances. The President of the United States, the actress, and the model attended the party. This sentence could be read as meaning that the president was an actress and a model. The president, the actress, and the model were at the party. Now this is much clearer. Compound sentences. Use a comma before the conjunction in compound sentences. Two or more in a compound sentence means two or more complete sentences joined by a conjunction like and, but, or so. So here are some examples of compound sentences. I live in Texas, comma, and my brother lives in Utah. I would love to go, comma, but I don't have any money. If the part of the sentence after the conjunction is not a complete sentence, do not use a comma. He went to the grocery store and bought some items for the party. So here, bought some items for the party is not a complete sentence. So therefore, you do not need to use a comma. You only need to use a comma before a coordinating conjunction if the other sentence is a complete sentence. In the above sentence, the words after and are not a complete sentence, so there is no subject, bought some items for the party. However, if the two parts of the compound sentence are very short and closely related, you do not need a comma. I played the piano and my brother danced. Sometimes authors will choose not to put a comma in a compound sentence. Unless the sentence is difficult to read, this is not a great problem. However, I would recommend using the comma. If two or more parts of the compound sentence are complicated and already contain commas, it is wise to separate the two sentences with a semicolon rather than a comma. And that's because semicolon is a shortcut for meaning and. So Harry, who is a surgeon, went to school on the East Coast, semicolon, but his brother Paul went to school in Europe where he met his wife. Note that then is not one of the fanboy conjunctions for, and, nor, but, or, so, yet, and cannot be used to connect two sentences unless you also use a conjunction or you use a semicolon. My sister went to the mall, comma, then she came home. That's incorrect. My sister went to the mall and then she came home. Or my sister went to the mall, then she came home. Between two adjectives. Use a comma between two adjectives in a row that both describe the same noun. You can usually tell if you need a comma by putting and between the adjectives. If it makes sense with and, then you need a comma. The dress had a big blue bow. Big and blue both describe bow. She wore a bright blue dress. Here there is no comma because bright describes blue rather than the dress. So in this example, big and blue both describe bow, so you can put a comma there. But in this example, bright is talking about blue, so you don't need to put a comma after this sentence, in this sentence, because you don't have two adjectives. So the old torn dress was not appropriate to wear for the wedding. Old and torn dress makes sense. So since both of these adjectives modify dress, then you can put a comma there. I have a new black purse. New and black purse? Probably not. No comma needed. So there you're saying, well, if you can say the two adjectives and put an and in the middle and it still makes sense, then you put a comma there. If you say the two adjectives, you put an and in between and it doesn't make sense. For instance, I would say new and black purse. No, that doesn't quite make sense. Then you know not to put a comma there. But if you can say old and torn, yeah, that makes sense. Then you put a comma between the two adjectives. Some important comma rules. Add commas where necessary for series, compound sentences, or consecutive adjectives. Some sentences here may be correct as they are. Joe was late for work, but he was on time for the meeting. So here you need a comma before the coordinating conjunction. Please buy eggs, milk, bread, and butter when you go to the store. Okay, this is already correct because this has commas in a series. I was late for school and late for dinner too. No comma needed because this part of the sentence is not complete. I bought a bright blue dress for the party. So we can't say bright and blue dress. So therefore, no comma here. I found some valuable jewels in my grandmother's old and dusty trunk. Okay, I can say old and dusty, so therefore comma goes over here. I brought pens, pencils, paper, and a notebook. So whether or not you decide to put a comma over here, that's the whole Oxford comma controversy. And that depends on your teacher and style guide. Use a comma between two, did that one. A comma is used after certain words, phrases, and clauses that come at the beginning of a sentence. Here are some examples of where commas should and shouldn't be used. So we would use a comma if you have transition words. First, we will examine the situation. Next, we will form a plan. So we always put a comma after a transition word. In my opinion, we are on the right track. We always put a comma after an introductory phrase. Indeed, I think you are right. Well, I think you should try to go with your friends. Yes, I think you are correct. By the way, I brought your book back to you. So those are all introductory phrases. And when you have introductory phrases or an introductory word for that matter, you need to put a comma. Introductory phrases. In Paris, we saw the Eiffel Tower. So here, introductory short prepositional phrases don't really require commas, but I would put a comma anyway because when you read the sentence, in Paris, we saw the Eiffel Tower. So when I read the sentence, there's a pause after in Paris. So I would put a comma there, but it's optional. I would put a comma. So in Paris, last September, we saw the Eiffel Tower. So even though I disagree with the grammar book, I think that any kind of prepositional phrases that's at the beginning of a sentence, you got to put a comma. According to the instructions, comma, we should do it my way. Walking down the street, comma, the man dropped his heavy bag. Make sure that when you use a participial phrase, like this example, the person doing the action is right after the phrase. Otherwise, you will have a misplaced modifier and quite possibly a silly sentence. So here, walking down the street is a participial phrase that modifies the man. So when you have a participial phrase, make sure that whatever it's modifying comes right after the participial phrase. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. So here, walking down the street, the man dropped his bag. That's correct, because who is walking down the street, right? The man is walking down the street. Now here, this is not correct. If I say walking down the street, the bag fell to the ground. So who's walking down the street? The bag is walking down the street. So here you end up with a silly sentence. So you're missing a subject, the man. Introductory phrases. So when you have an introductory phrase when you have an introductory phrase or a dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence, you need a comma. While I was walking, that's a dependent clause, comma, I ran into a friend I hadn't seen in years. After we ate dinner, comma, we went for a walk. Because we had run out of money, we couldn't buy any snacks at the movies. So these sentences all begin with adverb clauses, which is another way of saying dependent clauses. Generally, when the adverb clause is at the end of the sentence, we omit the comma. I ran into a friend I hadn't seen in years while I was walking. So while I was walking is a dependent clause, and when the dependent clause comes, or the adverb clause, same thing, comes at the end of the sentence, you do not need a comma. We went for a long walk after we ate dinner, no comma. We couldn't buy any snacks at the movies, no comma, because we had run out of money. Do not use a comma after introductory phrases if they are immediately followed by a verb. So if the introductory phrase, or if the prepositional phrase, and then you have a verb, then this is a simple sentence. So therefore you don't need, this is not an introductory phrase, this is a prepositional phrase. Into the cave, in the middle of the night, came a bear. So here you have a prepositional phrase, a verb, and a subject. And this sentence has the same meaning as a bear came into the cave in the middle of the night. So when you turn it around, then you understand that this is a simple sentence with subject, verb, and prepositional phrase. So a bear is the subject. Out of the blue came a man wearing a clown costume. To be an astronaut is my ambition. So to be an astronaut is an infinitive phrase used as a subject. So therefore it's not a introductory clause, so you do not need to put a comma there. So when the introductory clause or the adverb clause, when a verb follows the adverb clause, therefore we do not use a comma. So that is a good rule to remember. So commas needed. My brother Ken is in the army. The commas here imply that we don't need to mention your brother's name, either because he is your only brother or because the reader knows whom you are talking about. So these commas are needed if you're using additional information or information that is non-essential to the sentence. Then you can put commas here. My neighbor, the chief of police, is hardly ever home. The cake, chocolate with vanilla filling, was gone in a minute. The dress, by the way, was on sale. I say, indeed, you should come with us. So all of these are additional information that's not essential to the sentence, so therefore you put two commas. Mr. Paul, who has taught at the school for many years. So who has taught at the school for many years is an adjective phrase that modifies Mr. Paul. And so this is not essential to the sentence, so we put two commas. My brother, if he can get the time off, will go with us. So if he can get the time off is not essential to the sentence, and so therefore you put the two commas. The detective looked at the evidence. and if he found anything unusual, he didn't tell the news reporter about it. So my brother Ken is in the Army. As opposed to the very same sentence up above, let's assume you have more than one brother and you need to identify which brother you are talking about. In that case, no comma is needed because that information is necessary for the sentence. Therefore, if the information is necessary for the sentence, then you don't use commas. So this is called a restrictive element. It restricts the brother to Ken, not one of your other brothers. Here, you just only have one brother. So therefore, you only have one brother, so therefore Ken becomes additional information. So this is known as a non-restrictive element. And then if the element is essential to the sentence, then that is known as a restrictive element. So my neighbors across the street is very noisy. Identifies your noisy neighbor as the one across the street as opposed to the neighbor next door who's quiet. The cake with the white frosting was gone in a minute. Using no commas identifies the cake as the one with the white frosting, not another cake with a different type of frosting. So this assumes that you have like a table full of cakes and you have to point out, but which cake are you talking about? Then if you have to point that out, then no commas, and then it's essential information. All the teachers who have worked at the school for more than 25 years are retiring this year. The clause in bold is necessary to identify which teachers are retiring. So so if the information is essential for the identity or for the sentence to make sense, then no commas are needed. So here and then when you have other common uses for commas. So here, if you have etc., for example, and then for example, etc., if you are using any of these abbreviations in the middle of a sentence, use commas both and after the abbreviation. Since etc. is generally used at the end of the sentence, just use a comma before it. For more information about these three abbreviations, see Chapter 12. Etc. means so on and so on and so on. E.g. means for example. I.e. means that is. Here are some examples. Bring a pencil, pen, paper, eraser, etc. And then you put a comma before the etc. Etc. means more and more and more. Bring something to write with. For example, a pencil. So e.g. stands for example. I speak only one language. Then, so I.e. stands for then, my native language, English. So here you put a comma before the I.e. Dates. When you are writing the date at the top of a letter, use a comma between the day and the year. Whenever and wherever you write the date, if you omit the day, you do not need a comma between the month and the year. If you write the date in text, the year is followed by a comma if you have included the day. The two examples below are both correct. The March 2014 issue of Golf Digest has an article you should read. Or the March 5th, so if you include the day, then you have to put the comma. If you don't include the day, no comma. Commas with numbers. Now this you should have learned in mathematics. We always put a comma after every 3 zeros. Every 3 numbers, you put a comma. So use a comma in numbers of 4 or more numerals. So always every 3 numbers, comma. Then another 3 numbers, comma. So use a comma to separate 2 numbers that happen to fall in a row. Out of the total, then you have 3 numbers and then comma. So that's how you use it in numbers. I remember learning that in math. So if you use to, meaning also, in the middle of a sentence, it is set off with commas. However, if to is used at the end of the sentence, there is no comma. So here, if to is in the middle of the sentence, I too would love to see that play, then you have 2 commas. If to is at the end of the sentence, I would love to see that play too, then you don't need a comma. Direct address. When you are talking to someone using their name, regardless of where the name falls in the sentence, use commas to set off the name. Here are some examples, including examples using another word that also needs to be set off. Charlie, comma, eat that sandwich. Eat that sandwich, comma, Charlie. Eat that sandwich, Charlie, and then you can go out to play. No, Charlie, you cannot go out to play. Well, Charlie, did you finish your sandwich yet? So all the places where Charlie, the name, shows up, you need to have a comma. If Charlie shows up at the beginning of the sentence, you need 2 commas, and if Charlie shows up at the end of the sentence, you just need 1 comma. So setting off academic degrees. A comma is used to set off academic degrees. Mark Jones, PhD, comma, is speaking at graduation. Peter Wolf, MD, comma, has just started to work here. And also when you have addresses, usually it's between the city and the state. Then you have to put commas. I live at, and then the street, and then the city, and then the state. All of these all have to have commas. So commas are used in addresses, whether they are on the envelope, on the top of a letter, or used in a sentence. Use a comma to set off the name of the state when it follows the name of a city. So here you have the name of the city and then the name of a state. But if the state is not there in the sentence, I was born in Atlanta in a small farmhouse, you don't need to have a comma. Spell and punctuate company names exactly as the company does, whether you think it is correct or not. Contrasting expressions and elements. Use a comma in contrasting expressions. They usually begin with but, not, or rather than. So when you have 2 contrasting adjectives, that's when you have to put a comma. I like chocolate, comma, but not milk. I like non-fat milk, comma, not cream. I like my pizza with pesto, comma, rather than with tomato sauce. Use a comma in contrasting expressions. Here today, gone tomorrow. Garbage in, garbage out. Sometimes when a word is left out of a sentence intentionally, the sentence is difficult to understand. Use a comma if that is the case. Most of the time when a word is left out, the sentence is still perfectly clear. The fact of the matter is, comma, they never liked us. That before they is left out. This sentence is perfectly clear without a comma. I know she doesn't like us. Commas for emphasis, but don't overdo it. I agree completely with what you have to say. I myself will bake and decorate the wedding cake. Here, you would know where the emphasis is because you get a natural pause. So usually when you read over your paper, if you sense that there's a natural pause that occurs within that sentence, then that means you need a comma. That's what my English teacher used to tell us. Just go for the natural pauses. Use a comma in a greeting. So when you do a greeting and an ending in your letters, then you got to put a comma after that in business letters and that sort of thing. Unusual word order in a sentence. If you choose to write a sentence that has an unusual word order, you might need a comma for clarity. Why he wants to move to Michigan, comma, I will never understand. And then here, however and therefore always needs a comma when it's in the middle of the sentence because they are transition words. So when however and therefore are in the middle of a sentence, you need commas. Other times you will need a period or semicolon. How do you know? Read the sentence. If the sentence is fine without however or therefore, you can set the word off with commas. So here are some examples. I know, however, that he is coming with us. So therefore, I know that he is coming with us is fine. Therefore, commas are enough. I know that he is coming with us. However, I don't know how long he is staying. So I know that he is coming with us. I don't know how long he is staying is a run-on. So you need a semicolon before however. So in this case, you have two different sentences. And so in order to fix a run-on sentence, you either put a semicolon and however, or you can put a comma and a coordinating conjunction like but, or you put a period. So when you have two sentences together, then you need to put either a semicolon or a comma, or you could have a period. You capitalize however, but you always have to have a comma after however. Here is the best rule of all. Use a comma wherever not using one would be confusing. Here are some examples. After eating, ants invaded our blanket. Place a comma after eating to avoid eating ants. After eating, comma, ants invaded our blanket. The two dresses were blue with white dots and yellow with red dots. So more comma rule practices. So don't put commas here. Although there are many comma rules and places where you do need commas, there are also places where you don't use commas. Don't use a comma unless you have a reason. Here are some places where you don't use commas. Do not use a comma before fanboys conjunction for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, if the words that follow the conjunction are not a complete sentence. I washed the dishes and swept the floor. So here you have a compound verb. So with a compound verb, you do not need to have a, just like with a compound subject, with a compound verb, you don't need to have a comma. So swept the floor is not a complete sentence, so therefore no comma. If I said I washed the dishes and Ronald swept the floors, then you would have a complete sentence, then you would put the comma. Would you like pizza or chicken? Chicken is not a complete sentence, and the two items do not make a series, so therefore you do not need a comma. The conjunction but is an exception, and you can use a comma before it when the words on either side of it contrasts. She is tiny, comma, but strong. He took the sofa, comma, but left the chairs and table. Do not use a comma before or after something in parentheses unless the sentence would have a comma there anyway. So here, it's correct. The company president, he is my cousin, no commas, offered me a job. Incorrect. The company president, he is my cousin, comma, offered me a job. Although he is my cousin, the company president, comma, I think I would have gotten the job anyway. Now here you would already have a comma there, because here the dependent clause, when you have a dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence, you need a comma. So that's why you have to put a comma there. You do not need a comma after junior, senior, or esquire in a name. Martin Luther King Jr. is a well-known American. Never put a comma between a subject and its verb, unless there is an interrupter set off in commas between them. Wrong use of comma. Hannah and her brothers went to Paris last week. Wrong use of commas. The bright blue dress is in the subject, is in the closet. So here you have the subject and then you have the verb. So usually when you have a subject and a verb, you don't need to put a comma there unless there's an appositive. That's what they mean by interrupter. Never put a comma between a verb and its object. He threw the ball. So here you have subject, verb, object. So you don't need a comma between the verb and the object, just like you don't need a comma between the subject and the verb. Wrong use of comma. He is baking a cake and brownies. This is not a list, right? If I say he is baking a cake, he is baking 3 or 4 other things at least, then you use commas. It has to be like at least 3 or 4 things. Never put a comma between an adjective and its noun. She wore a blue dress. So we don't separate the adjective from its noun. It was a huge airplane. Once again, we don't separate the adjective from its noun. Never put a comma between a noun and a verb and a prepositional phrase. She was making cookies in the kitchen. So here when you have a verb, then you have direct object and a prepositional phrase, which is a simple sentence, you do not need a comma. Wrong use of commas. There are football fields, tennis courts, and a swimming pool at the school. Here, there should be no comma because we don't need a comma before a prepositional phrase. Sometimes you use a comma to avoid confusion. However, sometimes putting a comma in causes confusion, so you leave it out. Richard, my boss, and I are taking a break. In this sentence, you can't tell if the writer is talking about 2 or 3 people. Is Richard my boss? We can't tell. It is best to rewrite a confusing sentence like this. Here are 2 possibilities. Richard, who is my boss, and I are taking a break. I am taking a break with Richard and my boss. Sometimes you have a choice whether or not to use a comma. Of course, I will go with you. Of course, I will go with you. So if you choose to use a comma here, it gives the sentence more emphasis. If you are setting up something with commas, make sure you have your commas in the correct place. To check, read the sentence without the words within the commas. If it makes sense, you are okay. Incidentally, the same rule applies for words set off by dashes. Okay, they're going to do dashes next. In the next chapter, they're going to talk about dashes. This chapter only talks about commas. This car is as good as, but not better than, my old one. This car is as good as than my old one doesn't make sense. So this car is as good as, but not better than, my old one. Now the sentence is correct. That's the end of this chapter on commas. So this chapter on commas, it wasn't that hard to learn all the commas. So once you take your chapter 8 test, well, you'll know that now you are an expert in commas. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to email me anytime.